Hello, thank you for being with us today. I'm Ellie Witter, Associate Director of Alumni Engagement for Miami University Alumni Association. This year, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of the relationship between the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and Miami University. Miami University and Miami Tribe of Oklahoma first connected in 1972 when Chief Forrest Olds, having heard about a university in Ohio that shared a name with his tribal nation, showed up on campus unexpectedly during a visit to Cincinnati. What came with that surprise encounter is now a 50-year-long partnership between the two Miamis. Today, we are joined by George Ironstrack for the second installment of the Myaamia Center webinar series entitled A History of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. The sovereign Miami Tribe of Oklahoma is centered in what is today Northeast Oklahoma, but maintains many ongoing connections to the historic homelands that include what is today Western Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Southern Michigan, and Southern Wisconsin. This presentation will follow the path the Miami tribe took from the era before the contact with Europeans through colonization and will conclude by providing an overview of how this history has affected the educational needs of the Miami tribe citizens today. George Ironstrack is a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and the Assistant Director of the Myaamia Center at Miami University. He has participated in the Myaamia language renewal projects as both a student and a teacher since the mid-1990s. I am so pleased to welcome you, George. Thank you for being here with us. There will be time throughout the presentation for questions, so please submit your questions using the link just below the screen. And now I will turn it over to George.
Newe Ellie. Aya cheke newe pia ikwe kinde linda kaninge wahanungi ka kikwe. Nila Myaamia metosenia meme sheke wenzwane ne he meke muyane waha Myaamia nipayone kaninge Myaamia mission depone kaninge. Hello everyone, it's good that you're able to come here today on our computers to join together. As Ellie said, my name is George Ironstrack and I'm a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma and the Assistant Director of the Myaamia Center. I direct the Office of Education here at the Myaamia Center. And I'm here to share an overview of the history of my people in the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. This will be a 10,000-foot view. I'll try to take a couple of points to dive into more detail, but with the breadth of what I'm trying to cover, I won't get into detail everywhere. So I encourage if there's something I gloss over that you want to know more about, I encourage asking those questions. I'll stop a couple of times during the presentation to take questions. So before I start on history, though, I want to make sure I emphasize that, of course, we are not a people solely trapped in the past or defined by that history. Sadly, I think for most folks growing up in the Midwest of what is today the United States, I grew up in the Chicagoland area, most students only encounter tribal peoples in history books, and usually only rarely there. So we always want to take a moment throughout our presentations and emphasize that we're a living people with a past, but not solely a people of the past. And so I always begin with pictures of my community today so that folks can think of us as and know us as a living people, know the faces of our community. This is a shot of an elder in our community telling Al-Isukane, a winter story at our winter storytelling event in Myaamia, Oklahoma, pre-pandemic. And, you know, like all peoples, we gather and we tell stories. Like in the previous photo, we also gather and we play games. And so here's a photo of a game of Picket Tahaminge, Myaamia lacrosse, the first all wooden stick game that we had played in, as far as we can tell, a couple of 100 years. And this took place in Myaamia, Oklahoma in the summer of 2019. And like all peoples who are distinct and different, we have our own internal governance. So we're a sovereign tribal nation with inherent and retained rights within the boundaries of what is today the United States. And this is a photo of something that's rather boring, a bureaucratic meeting of folks gathering together to vote and govern the nation. In this case, this is a shot from during the pandemic. My tribe organized to have their meetings outside so the General Council could meet safely. And so this is from the fall of 2020. And then like all communities, we work on preparing the next generation to take over, leadership roles, but also be responsible community members in our community writ large. And so these are Myaamia students who are at Myaamia University as a part of our Myaamia Heritage Program. And this is from this previous fall. This is the full group of students. We have 38 currently. They represent the diversity of our nation today. So our nation, I'll talk about this as we get into the history. Our nation today lives in diaspora. We're spread across the United States, living in 49 different states. All of our families have differing kinds of connections to the tribal nation today. And so that photo of the students they come from that diaspora, and they come all together here in one place to learn together. The Myaamia tribe today is located, as Ellie said, our sovereign center of our nation is located in what is today Oklahoma, the part of Oklahoma that was formerly Indian territory. And there are 39 tribes in Oklahoma today. It's a pretty diverse piece of what we call Indian country. And it's like this. It has so many tribes within its boundaries because Indian territory was the end result of forced removals that precede the official policy in the 1830s, but accelerated in the 1830s. So a lot of the bigger tribes from the American Southeast were removed to what is today Oklahoma. And many tribes from this part of the country, from Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, were also removed eventually to Northeast Oklahoma. We had a layover, you could say, in Kansas before that. And then the little corner of Oklahoma where the Myaamia tribe sits today, the northeast corner, if you make the drive, let's say to Texas regularly, you actually maybe don't know it, but you pass through our little corner of Oklahoma when you first enter Oklahoma from Missouri on Route 44. But in our county, in Ottawa County, there are 9 tribes. So it's a really diverse county within a really diverse state in Indian country. And many of these tribes, you might recognize some of these names if you know Ohio history, are directly from this region. The Seneca Cayuga lived for a time here in what is today Ohio. The Wyandot were the last tribe forcibly removed from Ohio. The Odawa or Ottawa also lived in the Maumee River Valley. So there's deep connections that we all have with each other as neighbors that extend back into time before contact with Europeans. And we're neighbors today in Northeast Oklahoma. The Myaamia tribe's population centers, as I mentioned, we live in diaspora where we have 3 main population centers. And you'll see as we go through the history how these population centers reflect the story of our forced relocations as a community. Our largest population center is in Northeast Oklahoma in Ottawa County, or the areas right around Ottawa County. And that's where our sovereign land base is. That's where we have our headquarters located. It's where we own what they call trust land in which our laws as a tribal nation operate. That's our largest population concentration. The second largest population concentration is in what is today Indiana, in the Wabash River Valley, running from Fort Wayne down to Peru, following basically the Wabash River. And that population concentration lives within our homelands that were our homelands prior to contact with Europeans. And then our third largest population center is in eastern Kansas, south of Kansas City on the Missouri line, where our first reservation after forced removal was located. And we'll come back around to this story, but there's a population still there to this day, living in and around our former reservation lands. We also have citizens living in 46 other states. So 6,000 citizens spread across the United States in a way that creates a big challenge for us as a nation as we seek to revitalize and recover from a period of trauma and loss. This diaspora of our population is one of the big challenges that we face as a community. And then if we want to broaden that lens out really wide, it's not my area of expertise. I don't teach about other tribal nations, but I always want to make sure that folks are aware that, of course, the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma is not the only tribal nation in the United States. I'm sure no one thinks that, but I need to make sure that I point out the context that there are 574 total sovereign tribal nations within the United States. And this map gives you some sense of tribal lands in the United States. And I think if most folks are familiar with tribal lands, they're familiar with the big reservations like the Navajo Reservation or the big Lakota reservations in the West. But there's many, many smaller Indian lands, tribal reservations in the near Midwest, like Wisconsin and Michigan, but also on the eastern coast and of course on the West Coast that go more unnoticed. But all of our nations have homes of varying sizes that we maintain today within what is the United States. So Indian country is really diverse. Many different languages, many different cultures, many different histories. But what we share in common is a certain kind of American experience because of the process of colonization. Our legal statuses are deeply intertwined and woven together. Many of our experiences with things like boarding schools that I'll come back to have a lot of parallels. But still, there's many, many more distinct factors where nations are not the same. And oftentimes not even sort of mutually intelligible in terms of how we communicate and the cultural practices that we have. So I'll take a first stop here and open the floor to any questions folks might have about the Myaamia tribe today or the Myaamia lands and population diaspora today, or anything about our living community today.
Absolutely. So there is a question that has come in related to the population centers asking if the Northwest Ohio area around the Maumee River is connected to the Myaamia people.
Yes, that's a good question. And we have citizens who live in that part of Ohio, but it's not a big population concentration. So one family group left the Fort Wayne area in the 1800s and moved to the Maumee River Valley area, the Maumee, like Waterville, Toledo, that area. And their descendants still live there today. And there's a deep history of Myaamia villages in the Maumee River Valley. Once you get closer to Lake Erie, that's more Ottawa country, but kind of a rough bar would be sort of halfway down the Maumee, heading back towards Fort Wayne. You kind of cross a bar over into where a lot of Myaamia villages were.
Okay. And then another question related to the land acknowledgement statement. So what is the best way to approach the land acknowledgement statement in presentations to staff or alumni or just in general, since it is population is in diaspora, like what is the best way to approach that?
So the land acknowledgement statement that Myaamia University has, we helped write. And so I think using that one as it is, we're perfectly happy with it. I think that the land acknowledgement is a starting point, and it has to be kind of brief. So that I think the more detailed, if you're teaching a course, for example, more detailed information about the tribe could be woven into the course itself rather than just included in the land acknowledgement. And I think the important thing about our land acknowledgement at Myaamia University is that it recognizes the work that Myaamia University is doing as a result of acknowledging whose land this is. For us, that was really important because the idea with the land acknowledgement is it's supposed to connect to some kind of inherent responsibility that people have to each other. And Myaamia University's land acknowledgement is doing that. It's laying out what actions the university is taking as a result of recognizing whose land the university is built on.
Okay, wonderful. I think that's all for right now. So you can keep on going.
All right, Myaamia. So now I'm going to jump back into deep time. We say Mijamaha long ago. And sort of talk through differing perceptions of deep time. So this is one way to perceive or to think about and represent the places where people lived prior to contact with Europeans or around the time of contact with Europeans. This is a map produced by a well-known Algonquian linguist named Ives Goddard. And it attempts to position people based on the best research he had at the time on where people who spoke similar languages lived kind of next to each other, but also using other kinds of data. And so you can see the Myaamia, we call ourselves Myaamia there in northern Indiana, right where we still have populations living to this day. And you can see the Shawnee in the kind of central Ohio, just to our east. And then you can see the tribes living. The Illinois, who speak the same language as us, we consider them our younger siblings living mostly in what is today the state of Illinois. And then our close linguistic relatives, the Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, living just north of us in what is today Michigan. So this is one way to represent where people lived prior to contact. It's very kind of bounded, where you could almost think of these groups as nation states if you didn't know a lot about them. But it's only one way to think about the past and where people lived. For us as Myaamia people, we tend to think of our landscape prior to contact with Europeans as much bigger and broader. So this is a space we call today Myaamia. We recognize our ancestors didn't have a name for it because they didn't think of it, again, like a nation state. It was the place where they lived. But today we need, in English, especially as we are revitalizing knowledge in our community and teaching within our community, we need ways to talk about these things. And so we've given this space a name, Myaamia. It's a place where Myaamia people live and lived over time. But it's not an exclusive space. So we don't claim that there's no other peoples within the space. We're just describing our lifeways within this space. And the space is defined by language. It's defined by the rivers that we gave names to and that we lived on or traveled near regularly. So there are a few rivers outside of this space that have Myaamia names, but they're rivers that we did not visit regularly and didn't live around. And so it's for us very fitting that we use our language to define this space today. And if you're good at geography, you can probably make this out, but I'll point it out anyway. Starting where you see the little sunrise in the eastern part of the map, that's the western half of Ohio. And so you can see a slice of Lake Erie. And then we consider all of what is today Indiana as a part of our homelands, a small slice of southern Michigan as a part of our homelands. And then continuing west, you can see most of the outlines of what is today the state of Illinois as a part of our homelands. And to the north of that, a large chunk of what is today Wisconsin as a part of our homelands. And so this is a space where we say Myaamia people practiced our lifeways from time immemorial, Mijamaha. We know there was a time before this where we lived somewhere else, but for as long as we can remember as a people, this is the place where we've lived. So to give a little more detail to that, I have to kind of come forward in time a little more to give it better detail. So if you look at the 1700s, 1770s, 1780s, this would be one way to depict or represent our homelands. The red oval would represent the heartlands within our homelands. And this is that same stretch of the Wabash River Valley from about where Lafayette, Indiana is today, all the way up to where Fort Wayne, Indiana is today. And that red oval was viewed as relatively exclusive space. Only Myaamia people built our villages within that space for the most part. There were exceptions. If other folks from other nations wanted to build villages in or near that space, they usually had to ask permission. Outside of that space, though, the Miamis didn't have as much primacy. And so there's other groups who have their own heartlands, their own places where they live. And so you can see, for example, the Shawnee having their heartlands closer to where we are today. So where I'm speaking to you all from today is where the little blue dot is, kind of below the Delaware and in between the Shawnee. So that's where Myaamia University is located in our homelands, in a part of what is today Ohio that most tribes recognized as Myaamia hunting grounds. So it's a place that we regularly traveled and hunted. And then our largest village we've marked, it's Kihikayonge, or Fort Wayne. It's the red dot with the black circle around it. And that for much of our history was our largest village. So we say we lived in this space from time immemorial until the disruptions that came with the arrival of really first European diseases. And there was a series of wars generated by the European presence on the coasts that eventually impacted communities in the Midwest, even though we hadn't even made contact with Europeans yet. And so from that disruption forward, we had a lot of rapid change to deal with as a people. But the degree of change and the ability to adjust to those changes became ever harder in the period of time when the United States came into existence. So following the end of the U.S. Revolution, the American Revolution, which was mostly a non-event for us in Myaamia, but at the very end of that war, a series of invasions began of the lower Wabash River Valley and then the upper Wabash River Valley, coming first from Virginia into Kentucky, and then accelerating, where we fought against three lengthy campaigns, a long series of wars that we called the Myaamia Wars, our wars with the Americans. There was a lot of disruption, a lot of villages destroyed, of course, people killed. And at the ending of those wars, in 1794, those wars were brought to an end with the Battle of Fallen Timbers in the Myaamia River Valley. We were brought to the treaty table at the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. And that treaty marks the beginning of our relationship with the United States as a sovereign government-to-government relationship. Before I jump into that, I just want to harken back to the piece of artwork, the beautiful vest made by my relative Katrina Mitten, that was on the very first slide of this show. And this vest is her representation of one of our oldest stories. And it's a story that describes our arrival in our traditional homelands. We don't know the beginning of that journey, but the story describes the ending of that journey. And it begins in our language. Mehtame Myaamia nipengonje sa kachewe chike e honje sa kachewe wache sakiwe onge itamenge. And this vest goes on to tell that story. It's a beautiful piece of artwork. And the place where this story takes place, this arrow is kind of pointing to the region, is in and around the area that is today South Bend, Indiana. And so this story, we can kind of plant it in our landscape, and we can talk about our people arriving in that river valley, and then where we went from there, eventually settling the Wabash River Valley to the south. Today, years after that, sometime after that, the Potawatomi eventually moved into that same river valley, what we call Sakiwe Sipiwe, the coming out river. And today, South Bend is very much, we see that as a Potawatomi place where they have primacy, they have trust land, their government governs a piece of land within the town of South Bend. But we also, for us, it's a very important place. It's where we began as a distinct and different people in our traditional homelands. So as I mentioned, at the end of our wars with the Americans, we were forced to come to the treaty table in 1795. And under pretty serious duress, we negotiated an agreement to cede, for us, what is today Southwest Ohio. But other tribes were forced to cede their ownership of most of the rest of Ohio except for Northwest Ohio. But we don't see those territories as part of our traditional homelands at that particular time. So we mark it on the map, but the main portion that for us was ceded was today Southwest Ohio, including where Myaamia University sits today. So that Myaamia University could come into existence is built on the foundation of the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which was the price for peace. To get peace with the United States, we had to agree to cede this land. And so this process then of warfare transitioning into treaty making is almost seamless from the perspective of the loss of land. So the mechanism changes from direct violence. There's one more war that we fight with the Americans during the War of 1812, but for the most part, the mechanism transitions to one of political power and economic power that puts us in very difficult situations where our leaders are forced to or need to cede our homelands in order to find a way forward to survive. And so over the following 50 years, and I'll kind of go through this a little bit quickly here, ourselves and other tribes, because even though we used all of this land, the United States decided in some cases who had primacy in particular spaces to sign treaties. So we weren't always at the treaty table when these other cessions were made. But over the next 50 years, the majority of our homelands were ceded. There's one large piece of land in West State, Illinois, that we never ceded to the United States. But for the most part, over the next 50 years that followed the Treaty of Greenville, we were forced to cede our homelands to the United States. And there's there's a story that goes with each of these treaties, and today we don't have time to go through all of them. But I thought I'd pull up one story from a treaty that kind of happened in the middle of this process, because it's a very dynamic, and it's a traumatic thing to read today as a Myaamia person, but it's a very dynamic treaty process, and you can see very clearly in just a couple of snippets how these processes worked against us. And this treaty is called the Treaty of the Wabash, or the Treaty of 1826, sometimes called the Treaty of the Mississinewa, because it was supposed to be held on the Mississinewa River Valley, in the Mississinewa River Valley, but it was actually located. They found a good spring to have clean water during the treaty on the Wabash River, so that's where the treaty was held. In what is today the town of Wabash, Indiana, that's where this treaty was held. At the very beginning of this treaty, Governor Lewis Cass, who's governor of Michigan Territory, one of the goals of this treaty was to define the boundary between what is today Indiana and Michigan. So they could very clearly have state boundaries, and they needed to know, because Miamis and Potawatomis are both there, who owns what and who has the right to cede what. So they're trying to figure this out so they can, on the sort of the U.S. government side, clarify their boundaries. But of course, it's our homelands and Potawatomi homelands, and so this is a fraught process. But Governor Lewis Cass opens the treaty by with this wish to purchase this country, right? But also he's mentioning right in 1826 that also you should remove. And so this is one of the first times that U.S. government policy begins to push for removal of our tribal nations, which our leaders completely refute notions of removal. But I think what's interesting when I read this is that there is discord between and violence sometimes taking place between settlers, American settlers who live nearby our lands, and our people. And Cass's solution to this, I think sadly in human societies, there's always going to be violence. There's always going to be crime. But his solution is, when there's crime that occurs, when a murder occurs, well, it's because, we both have bad people in our communities, so you need to leave. I think we can all see the degree of injustice in that decision. But they argue for numerous days, and the Miamis basically over and over again say, you're asking us now, here in 1826, to cede the very land where we sleep. You're asking us to cede our very beds, and we can't do that. And at the end, near the end of the treaty, the main speaker for the treaty, Myaamia, he says, well, if our conclusion not to sell suits you, we are very glad, and we will not sell any. They think it's kind of the end of the negotiation. And Governor Cass becomes very angry at this point. And he says, that, as you can read here, that we've signed a treaty with the Potawatomi for this same land because your ownership of it overlaps. And basically, if you don't agree, we're just going to hold that land. We're going to take that land under the terms of the Potawatomi Treaty, and then you get nothing. And then he says, we're not here to be trifled with by Myaamia speeches. So he's upset. Myaamia is a pretty adept debater in this treaty, and he was upset by it. And so then he ends and just says, if you don't have a proposition for us, then we're not going to meet you again in council. And the council breaks. And there's a break in the negotiation for 7 days. There's no notations in the official record from the United States government. And then 7 days later, on October 23rd, the treaty record just says the treaty is read aloud, and then the Miami sign it. There's a list of all the leaders who signed the treaty and the claim to our lands north of the Wabash River that we ceded. And so, when we look at this treaty inside our community, we oftentimes ask the question, what happened in those intervening 7 days? They went from not signing a treaty to signing it. And so something changed during those 7 days. And what were those 7 days like? What kind of tension existed in the community? We know there was tension, potential violence between Miamis and Potawatomis because of this divide and conquer method that the United States was using at the treaty table. And so it must have been a very difficult period of time to be in that camp on the Wabash River there in Wabash, Indiana, working through what they were going to do. The outcome, though, is rather startling, especially if you compare it to what the Potawatomis received from their treaty. The Miami tribe called the Myaamia Nation at this time, received a permanent annuity from the United States government, a yearly payment of $25,000. This is in a period of time when cash on the so-called frontier was very, very hard to come by. So receiving cash payments gave you a lot of economic leverage. They also received $15,000 in goods over 2 years. And then you can see other items given to family leaders who are essentially the heads of small village communities within the Myaamia Nation as a whole. And you can see cattle and hogs, in some cases relatively mature cattle, 4 to 6 years old. And you also see a rather large amount of iron, steel, tobacco, and then the work of laborers who were most often put to work building houses or putting up fencing to protect community land. And then most significantly from my perspective as a historian, the treaty also created 11 community reserves. So these were large areas of land reserved to the community and protected from sale or seizure from debt. You could think of them kind of like reservations. They're not truly reservations, but kind of like that mini ones that belong to the entire tribal community. And then the treaty created 23 individual reserves that belonged to individuals. These were also protected from sale or seizure and operate a little bit differently than a reservation, more like what we'll talk about in a minute in allotment. But these pieces of land that were created, retained out of other land that was ceded, and the financial resources and trade good resources the nation was getting were meant to replace the resources we originally could gain access to from our lands. And so it was an attempt to adapt the nation, to restructure the economy of the nation, to survive on a much smaller land base. And it's what other anthropologists and historians have called adaptive resistance, so that resisting through violence was no longer an option. And you couldn't just say, we're not going to sign the treaty, because then you just lose the land. And so how are you going to, in this context of oppression and a certain kind of political force, how are you going to find a way forward for your nation? And this treaty gives a really nice example of all those forces coming to play in one place. And, I think myself, I see a path forward that if other forces hadn't come into play, if other individuals, those with power, hadn't continued to game the system, our people were successfully adapting to a system. They just couldn't control the rules of that system. And so other folks continued to change the rules to always overcome the skillful adaptations that my ancestors were making. And that leads us towards forced removal. So one of the goals eventually with creating those small individual and communal parcels of land is that in the absence of a large reservation, there was still land for people to live on. And so as removal became much more a thing beginning in the 1830s, as there was increased pressure to remove, folks believed that they could avoid removal potentially by giving up the big reservation and living on these small plots of land. And in fact, it appears as though at least one representative of the United States, whether formally or informally, said that if you sign this treaty in 1840 agreeing to removal, you'll have to give up your reservation, but no one will have to actually go on the removal who doesn't want to go. And anyone who wants to stay could just live on these parcels of land that were scattered throughout the Wabash River Valley, where Myaamia people still live to this day. Unfortunately, again, as I said, the system kept being gamed against our people. And the U.S. Army was called in, and the terms of the removal treaty were enforced through threats of violence. And the removal began in October of 1846 from what is today, or it was then Peru, Indiana, a village for us called Ixquipisinongue. And that removal went via the canal systems, first via the Wabash-Erie Canal, and then via the Miami-Erie Canal down to what is today Cincinnati, and transferred to steamships there. And then the removal journey followed the river system out to Kansas Landing, or Kansas City, what is today Kansas City, Missouri. Then folks traveled via horse and wagon south on the Missouri side of the border, eventually crossing over into the unorganized Indian Territory, what is today Kansas, onto a new reservation that was supposed to be 500,000 acres. But we were the last to arrive in that part of Kansas, and there was really only 325 left in that little puzzle piece. So our nation was actually shorted out of 175,000 acres in eastern Kansas. So I'll stop there again and open the floor to questions that folks might have about our deep history, as well as our history with early contact with Europeans and the United States.
Yeah, so a lot of the questions that come in are more present day. Related with Diaspora, what is the process being undertaken to locate and quantify the 6,000 people of the nation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the 6,000 is based on folks who have actively sought to maintain connections to the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma. Then they've established the connection on their end. You have to, if you weren't enrolled as a citizen as a child when you were born, then you have to seek connecting citizenship as an adult. So it all takes sort of conscious action on the part of the citizen. And then the Myaamia tribe today creates, really the main work is educational work, to reach out to the diaspora, to provide educational opportunities, both in person and now, especially in the era of COVID, virtual activities, but also a lot of print materials have historically gone out to tribal households. And then we've created a lot of online like blogs and newspapers, and of course use Facebook to maintain the community that way. Now, if as a child your parents didn't enroll you as a citizen, there is a process for establishing citizenship in the nation, but it's pretty arduous. You have to prove descent. So you have to show birth and death certificates back to a Myaamia person who's on one of the many lists that were created in the 19th century and in the early 20th century to create allotment lists, reserve lists, and then eventually the early citizenship rolls for the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma after organization in the 1930s. So we still have folks reconnecting regularly who do that work and reestablish those connections legally. The cultural side of that, though, is much easier. Being a really small community, we know all of our families. It's pretty rare that I meet a Myaamia person who introduces themselves. If they know their genealogy, it's pretty rare that I don't know their family, their kin group. And that, for us, that's kind of the cultural passport. You come in, you introduce yourself, and then we know, oh, that's the family group you're from. Oh, okay, now we know who you are. You're one of us. And then, of course, you have inherent obligations and responsibilities to that family group, and then that family group has responsibilities to the nation. So it's kind of, it is interwoven and integrated in that way.
Wonderful. That actually answers another question that came in related to the process to be a tribal citizen. And a question now going back into history related to the land, and you're saying that when you were removed to Kansas, that it wasn't the amount of acres as promised. Is it known how that was decided or why that happened?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know with a fine degree of detail. I know that the man McCoy who surveyed the reservation, maybe wasn't the highest trained surveyor in the time period, but we were pretty boxed in. So we were arriving, and the other tribes were already there. We were one of the last to arrive. So 1846 is a really late removal for Great Lakes removals for other tribes, and so there wasn't a lot of land left. And so I've never actually researched it down to the perfection of the acreage, but just looking at it, I don't know how you could get another 175 out of where we were. It would have to have been somewhere else, and then you would have had two plots. And our people at the time didn't have folks within the nation who could double check their work. And so they just told us it was 500,000 acres. And if you look at the treaty that followed, which I'll show in a second, that still mentions, this is in 1854, that treaty still mentions the reservation being 500,000 acres. So that eventually got dealt with in the Indian Claims Commission in the 20th century, where the Myaamia tribe was eventually paid restitution for the shortage on those acres. But it took, that's 100 years later before that happened.
And then one more, do the Myaamia people recognize the mounds and earthworks in Ohio and Indiana as ceremonial or burial grounds for their people?
That is a really good question. Answering definitively about earthworks is really difficult. So I think I want folks to approach my answer with a large grain of salt. In our community today, we do not claim to be the direct descendants of the people who built those mounds and earthworks. We believe, though, that there is certainly intermarriage and kinship connections to those people. And we certainly recognize those sites as the ceremonial sites of other people. And that the events that took place there, what people might call ceremony, some of our ancestors may have participated in, because there are, in many cases, interethnic sort of centers where people came together to celebrate particular moments in the year. And so we recognize a certain kind of connection, but it's a little bit peripheral for us. We don't have language around mounds or earth building, and we know other indigenous peoples have that language. It doesn't mean our people didn't help build mounds or maintain mounds, but it wasn't central to our culture. But today, this is not work I do, but work that folks in the Cultural Resource Office of the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma do. There's very much a concerted effort to work together with others to protect those sites. Because they are the legacy of all the indigenous people of North America, and we recognize a connection to the land that those earthworks sit within, and we have a deep connection to that place, and so therefore, by extension, a respect for what was done in that place over time by other indigenous people.
Wonderful. I think we can continue on now.
All right, Naoe. So now I'm going to set up a series of, and this because of time, I'll probably speed up a little bit here. So forgive me if I gloss over something, but I'm going to set up sort of how the diaspora came to exist. So our people now are with forced removal. What I didn't talk about in the first step of forced removal is that in 1846, around 150 Myaamia people were allowed to remain in Indiana. And over 320 were removed west to what is today Kansas. So now you have the nation split into two, relatively similar size population concentrations. In the west, in the Myaamia Nation's lands in what is today Kansas, you have very quickly a diminishment of the reserve. So in 1854, the nation signs a treaty agreeing to diminish the reserve down to 70,000 acres from, again, supposed 500, but it was only 325. And within that 700 to allot or subdivide that land and give it to individual heads of households or individual members of the nation. And those individual parcels would be protected for a time from sale or seizure. But the goal here from the United States perspective was to break up communal land and transform indigenous people into kind of like immigrants into the nation, into the United States as a nation, where they would become yeoman farmers on the edge of the plains. And eventually, as tribal land was broken up, the goal was the tribal nation would break up and disappear. And so the people would be absorbed into the United States, and the Myaamia Nation would cease to exist. So it's not warfare, but it is a certain kind of cultural genocide, because the goal with these land policies was to pulverize the nation, to divide it up, and to atomize the people through their land. And so this allotment occurred in 3 waves of the Myaamia Nation in Kansas between 1854 and 1869. And then here's just a zoom in of that process. You can see a little bit better. One of the things that the Myaamia people do is they've been living there for long enough to know where the good farmland was. And so especially the first round of allotments are all taken within the river valleys in the floodplain lands that are arable lands. So a lot of Kansas is not arable. It's good for grazing in this period of time before modern fertilization. And so, our people wanted to build our homes on that land. And this created conflict with settlers that began, even before the Civil War, but especially accelerated throughout the United States Civil War, where folks moved into Kansas and basically the quote unquote Indians had occupied all the good land. And this frustrated European white settlers as they were coming into Kansas, and they began to once again push for the removal of the Indians because we had the good land and we weren't using it properly. So this leads to our second forced removal. After the Civil War, Kansas is a state, became a state at the beginning of the Civil War. And once the Civil War ends, then there's a concerted effort to remove tribal nations from the state of Kansas. And so the Myaamia tribe and others signed a rather large omnibus treaty in 1867. And a part of that treaty is the agreement to move south to Indian Territory. And basically the language of the treaty was that you'd self-remove. So there weren't army involved. You weren't moved to the point of a gun. You basically had to move yourself and your belongings and your family to Indian Territory and take up residence within a new reservation if you wanted to remain a part of your tribal nation. You were given a choice. If you wanted to stay in Kansas, you could relinquish your citizenship, and like an immigrant, you could swear to become a citizen of the United States in court, and then you kind of leave one citizenship behind and take on another one. In this particular period of time, the United States believed you couldn't be both. You couldn't be a citizen of your tribal nation and the United States. And so again, we have a division. So we have the original division, Indiana to Kansas, and then you have another division, Kansas to Oklahoma. By the time of allotment, there's 66 people in Oklahoma. There was, right around 100 that made the move to what is today Oklahoma, and some, maybe 30 that stayed behind in Kansas. And so you have another fracturing of the nation. And then in Oklahoma, you have the same process of fragmentation of land, and this furthers the diaspora. So we buy a piece of the Peoria Reservation, so it becomes a jointly owned reservation called the Myaamia and Peoria Reservation, or the Peoria and Myaamia Reservation. And that reservation was a total of 50,000 acres that we both shared together. So you're thinking about the decreasing land base. We were supposed to get 500,000 in Kansas. Now we're arriving and we're just getting a part of 50,000 in West Oklahoma. We actually owned about just over 17,000 acres of that reservation. Folks arrived realizing that the process in Kansas that happened was likely going to repeat itself, and there was going to be allotments. So they started to build their homes thinking of that, and they clustered together in family groups. So the different colors on this map represent like family groups who chose their allotments all around each other and built their homes there. In the end, by the time allotment occurred, following the legislation in 1889, sorry, the fire department's going by, 66 allotments were created, about 200 acres each. And the remnant land was eventually sold at auction. We weren't allowed to keep the remnant land. This is one of the goals of allotment, was to just give people enough to live on for that generation. And then anything excess that could have been passed on to the next generation will be sold to non-native people. And then you'd have a lot of non-native neighbors, oftentimes creating a checkerboard effect where you couldn't have sort of a consolidated population anymore. This way, kind of furthering the attempt to disintegrate the nation and absorb them into the United States at large. And here's a zoom in of a part of this reservation that, for many of us, that we know really well today, because the Myaamia tribe has begun the process of buying back this land and bringing it back into the nation. So the red oval here represents a pretty important property for Myaamia people today that the Myaamia tribe owns, called the Sipikwawike, or the Jane Drake allotment. And there sits the Drake House, which has been added back onto because one wing had been blown off in a storm. And now the tribe owns this land, and it's a major place, like a boarding house, where we all stay when we're down there for particular like high points. And there's lots of people down. There's groups that stay here. Large tribal events happen here, lacrosse games, dances. And so it's a wonderful space that a lot of us know really well. Slept many an hour inside Sipikwa's house. And so it's an example of the attempt to recover from all these losses. But, I don't want to undersell the importance of the fragmentation. So that as these lands were allotted and divided up, their protections only endured for 25 years. And in many cases, the land, people petitioned to sell their land before the 25 years were up, because the next generation had no place to live. And they would often, as soon as they were adults, they would leave the Myaamia, Oklahoma area to find work to survive, find a place to farm their own, or take up a job in the railway or mining someplace else. And so very quickly, the next generation after removal starts to move out because there's no land for them to have. And then the sad after effect is when their parents are finally elderly, they have no one to pass their land to because their kids have gone elsewhere to live, which leads to them wanting to sell their land and move into town because they're too old to farm anymore. And so this just accelerates land loss. And then you can see the diaspora just accelerates. And this happens in all of the main population centers. So in Kansas, the same phenomena happens. And in Indiana, the same phenomena happens. The reasons why and the mechanisms how land in Indiana became lost were a little bit different. We don't have time to get into it today, but it's relatively the same process where then folks have to leave that area to find work. So my family today lives in Chicago because they had to leave Fort Wayne because our family reserve land was lost and we had no place to live. And so to find a new home and build a new support system for our families, folks just moved, Detroit for the car industry, just all over the United States, Oregon and Washington State for the gold and timber industry. So we today have these populations all over the United States as a result of this fragmentation. Now, what didn't happen, what the United States hoped would happen, but what didn't is the connection to a Miami identity didn't get completely destroyed, and folks continued to come home to visit, whether that was going home to Indiana or home to Kansas or home to Myaamia, Oklahoma, or home to all three, depending on the circumstances. Folks continued to maintain their kinship connections to each other and their connections to these different homelands. And that is the major reason why the Myaamia tribe survived this period of disintegration of land base. You add on top of this the negative experience of the schooling system, whether that's boarding schools or day schools. What happens then is a lot of Myaamia language transmission and some Myaamia cultural transmission is cut off. So the negative experiences that these young people had in boarding schools makes them hesitant to teach the language and some aspects of the culture, especially aspects of the culture that were viewed as savage by Americans. They didn't pass those on. Things that Americans viewed as valuable, like medicinal knowledge, that sometimes was passed on. So there's kind of this filter through which American culture determined what you passed on from your own tribal culture. But in this image, only one of these young people is Myaamia. And this was the classic boarding school experience where you're surrounded by other indigenous youth, but they don't speak your language. So the language you have in common is English. So the young man who's second from the left standing in the back, that's Wapaimangwa. And he's the only Myaamia person in this particular photo from the class of 1894 at Haskell Indian School. And so you have very quickly, as the land base declines, our language also declines, and some aspects of our cultural transmission also decline, so that by the turn of the 20th century, our language is no longer being taught to children under 5. And by the 1960s, the last first language speakers of our language from that era begin to pass away. And our language enters a period of what we call dormancy. It went to sleep. So here's where I'll really speed up and just kind of, unfortunately, go speed through the reorganization and rebuilding period. But I think it's been the presentations of others, like my relative, Daryl Baldwin, who talked in more detail about the recovery and rebuilding of language revitalization. You can watch the recording of his talk if you want to know more about this. But from the allotment period in the late 1800s until really the Great Depression is a really dim period of our history. And many of our elders talked about they weren't sure the nation was going to survive that period. But some important things happened during the Great Depression period that helped facilitate and allowed us to channel our own energies a little better as people so that we could survive. And one of the foremost of these is a major policy shift by the United States government called the Indian Reorganization Act. That eventually applied to Oklahoma through the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, happened 3 years later. But this act, essentially, if you think about it in broad terms, it said we're no longer going to try and exterminate Native people, either literally or through cultural genocide. And we recognize that our education policy and our land policy allotment have left tribal peoples in a horrible situation where they don't have the full ability to group themselves together as tribal nations on their land anymore, but they also aren't fully integrated U.S. citizens thriving in U.S. society. They're stuck in this terrible in-between place that especially in the Great Depression was defined by horrible poverty. And so this program was designed to help tribes rebuild economic self-sufficiency and through that begin to improve themselves as tribal peoples. Now, it's just one take on how a people should recover, right? It's heavily focused on economics, but it was an important shift where policy actually brought energy to tribes to help us in various ways. To do this, most tribes had to reorganize under a constitutional form of government that reflected the United States notion of what a real government is. And the Myaamia tribe did that under the terms of the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act. We formed a constitutional government that is still in existence today. We've modified it. We've amended that constitution multiple times, and we'll continue amending it to meet our needs. But that's the source of that form of government for us now. And then in the 1960s and 70s, land began to be returned to the tribe. Families began to donate former allotment lands back to the tribal nation. A few families held on to their allotments, and those were donated back, or at least an acre or two of them was donated back. And then the state of Oklahoma actually provided a large land base for all of the tribes to build their tribal headquarters on in very near downtown Myaamia, Oklahoma. And then you have a slow building of this sort of economic self-sufficiency that accelerates for us with the passage of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act in 1988. Within 10 years of the passage of that act, we opened our first casino jointly operated with the Modoc tribe in Oklahoma. And it's the profits from that casino that really allow us to reinvest in our nation for the first time in ways that have a direct and powerful impact on language and culture revitalization. So the economic resources put in play by the Indian Reorganization Act, oftentimes they would affect kind of healthcare, housing, food, but there was no funds available for language and culture. And so the profits from gaming was really the first time we had our own income to use in ways we wanted to, which included especially language and culture. And then it's no surprise that out of that you have, in 2000, the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma's Cultural Resource Office is founded, which is the main office that the Myaamia Center works with. We're the research arm of the Cultural Resource Office. And then a year after that, the Myaamia Center is founded, though at first we were known as the Myaamia Project. And all of these things connect to a much deeper rebuilding that's going on in the nation that includes land, people, resources, economic and otherwise, that continue to fund this growing, robust effort going forward. And that the end product of this is what we call picking up the threads of our knowledge, reconnecting our community together, symbolized by this web we're creating here with our young people, that reconnects the diaspora, literally brings people home, or virtually brings people home, depending on the educational format. And that this work at revitalizing the community is one that's it's intergenerational effort. So we recognize, you saw the story of the harm done to us over generations. We recognize it's going to take generations to work to heal that harm and to rebuild the community from this large diaspora. So if you want to learn more about, if you want to support the work of the Myaamia Center, we really encourage folks to learn more about sovereign tribal nations. Wherever you live, you should know who the sovereign nations are in your area, or if they were removed, who were the sovereign nations who had their homelands there before. And continue to learn more about the Myaamia Tribe of Oklahoma and our ongoing work with Myaamia University. And there are places to lend financial support as well through the Myaamia Center's endowment, or to support Myaamia students here, or our work, which I didn't present on, but my relative and friend Daryl Baldwin did, our work with other tribes, helping them revitalize their languages from dormancy using documentation the way we have. Something I didn't get a chance to really talk about much today. And if you want, again, learning more about our relationship between the Myaamia Tribe and Myaamia University, we recommend reading the Myaamia University profile called Two Myamis. And then we also have a podcast, Myaamia Stories from Myaamia Revitalization. And then there should be, just up now, recordings from our conference, which was this past Saturday, which our friends here in the alumni office live streamed for us and recorded. It's great. Big mission day to them for that. You can also sign up for the Myaamia Center newsletter. I believe you'll get an email after this presentation with that information. So So, Mishinewe, big thanks to all of you for being such a great audience as I share the story of my community, and Newe especially to Ellie and JJ for their help organizing my presentation. And once again, Mishinewe to the entire MU alumni staff who helped us live stream our conference last week. And I will stop there and take questions if there are any.
Wonderful. You answered the last question that we had of how to support, and to expand on that, on this page for this presentation, there are links to everything that you talked about. The newsletter, the donations, all of those things are available on our website, and the email will also be included with all of those links for everyone watching. So thank you so much for joining us today, George. This Myaamia Center webinar series is a 6-part series, and throughout 2022, the next one will be on Wednesday, June 1st at noon Eastern Time for a session on the history of the Myaamia tribe and Miami University, presented by Cameron Shriver. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Newe. Bye.